Zac Taylor will be the head coach for the Cincinnati Bengals for the foreseeable future. Let's talk about the culture and the impact it's had on the Cincinnati Bengals.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. Today, we're joined by Matt Minnich of Chalk Talk, does some work over at Cincy Jungle. And Matt, welcome to the show. We're here every day on the Locked On Bengals podcast. For those of you that are new to the program, thanks for making us your first listen here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day, free and available anywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. And Matt, last week you were listening to the show right after Zac Taylor's extension was announced, and something caught your ear. Something I think it was me that said that, it'd be fun maybe to get a debate going on the people that really dislike Zac Taylor's play calling and think that he's bad at situational football. And you had some strong feelings about that and on the culture side and about some of the things that a lot of fans don't think about that NFL head coaches have to deal with. You have coaching experience, of course. Your Twitter handle at Coach Minnich. For those of you that don't follow him, you should. Great X's and O's stuff and some cool insight on the Bengals that maybe is a different perspective than you get from Locked On Bengals. And so you're here to talk about the culture that you've observed from the outside in Cincinnati and some of the impacts that you think, and maybe some of the things that are undersold about Zac Taylor's coaching, the positives to his coaching approach in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I mean, it really. When you said that, I was like, "Well, I got to be on this," because all I ever hear about is play calling, and I just think, I think that's a big problem that they have in the NFL is they hire too many play callers, and they don't hire enough leaders. And look, there was no way to know this about Zac Taylor, and I think a lot of people were really excited about him because he's a young offensive mind. We didn't necessarily know that much about him when they brought him in, but we were excited about that concept of it. But I think his strength really seems to be based on the culture he's been able to build and how he's been able to bring this whole group together. And I think you look at just the way, we'll start with Burrow. Obviously, Burrow's the accelerator, and without Burrow, we're not in the Super Bowl. Without, like that wasn't happening. Taylor didn't turn this thing around on his own, but the wheels were in motion, prior to that. And I think you could see, for instance, like the way they were fighting to win that Miami game that none of us wanted them to win. Tyler Boyd was hurting himself in the field trying to get that win at the end. But like the way you could see those guys fighting for that win that could have potentially cost them the first overall pick in that draft because they were trying to build that culture that was about winning, about fighting, and competing together. And again, it's the end of the year, and when really, if you think about it, the most benefit that you get from that game is losing it and getting the number one pick. But they're out there competing. So I think you look at how that works. I think you look at how from the moment Burrow got here, the two of them, like their press conferences could be interchanged. Zac Taylor, not quite the slick dresser that Joe Burrow is, but like you hear them talk, and it's like these are two guys who are on the same page, 100%. And when Burrow's helmet goes off and he's calling his own plays in that game, I guarantee he's doing what Zac Taylor wanted him to do because you could see that relationship there, and that they're on the same page. So I think just overall that connection, you've got that great leader that you were able to draft, that we were lucky to be able to get. But I think you've got a great leader on the sideline who's pulling it all together from an entire team standpoint.
Yeah, I think the smartest thing Zac did was get in with Burrow, right, and get in his not good graces necessarily, but earn that confidence from him. Because if everyone's buying into Burrow, even if you have your questions about Zac, if Burrow believes in Zac, then it just goes hand in hand, right? And you don't have the eye rolls, have all of those things. I think, and the one thing that stands out to me the most about this past year with Zach is they threw everything at Burrow from a playbook standpoint after doing a lot of the LSU concepts. It was kind of like, let's throw everything at him versus a place that I came from and I covered for a couple years. Kevin Stefanski gets to town in Cleveland, and it's Alex Van Pelt, used to be on Zach's staff in 2019. And they kind of pacify Baker Mayfield, and they don't throw everything at him. And so I think that veterans see that. And from a coaching standpoint, when you do that, I think that has an impact too. One, in the belief of the quarterback, but two, believing that you have the right coach that's leading the way. Do you agree with that? Do you think that has an impact?
Yeah, and I think that you need to understand who your team is, and you need to understand who you are. And I think, look, this is a very young coaching staff.
Yeah.
Lou Anarumo is an old guy, but Lou Anarumo is a young defensive coordinator because he doesn't have that experience. And it's a very, very young team. They brought in a bunch of guys who have playoff experience, and especially college football playoff experience, so that definitely helps with the culture shift, bringing in those guys who know how to win, they know how to prepare to win. But I think that's part of being, I think they really embrace being a young team, this year. We can complain about some areas where it'd be great to have a veteran there, but there's something to say for that, for being a young, going for it, YOLO kind of team. And I think that's what you do. You're like, hey, I'm a young coach. This is my young quarterback. I'm going to throw it at him. I'm going to trust him. Which, it sounds like that was kind of the opposite of what was going on with Stefanski. Stefanski took over mid-season as offensive coordinator in Minnesota. Like, he didn't have a ton more experience than Taylor did, really, with play calling and all that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. You've got that guy with that attitude, with that swagger, and you're kind of letting him take ownership of it, like anything. And I think any of us can relate in our own professions. Whether it's having an editor as a writer who lets you pick your own stories and lets you go about things the way you want to do it. When you're able to have ownership in your work, like, you're gonna get better results out of people when you let them thrive, and kind of cut the cords a little bit.
That's such a great point. Like, in my personal life, that really resonates with me, and I'm sure some of our listeners out there feel the same way. As soon as, like, a manager in my other job, my non-podcast job, comes along and says, hey, you should do it this way, is when I start looking for another job. You know what I mean? And so when you have that ownership and you have that freedom and that relationship where it's like, okay, I trust you to do your job and you trust me to do my job, and you have that reciprocal trust, which it really seems like Burrow and Taylor have, I think that's really important. And the other thing that, has stood out to me in this conversation so far is you talk about the leadership of Burrow, the leadership of Zac Taylor, and you can see it in the way that the whole team presents themselves. You talk about how Joe Burrow and Taylor's press conferences are interchangeable, and I think you see little bits of the quarterback and the head coach's personality in this team. And James could tell you, and if you've been listening to the show every day, you would know that I've said this in the past. You see these elements of Joe Burrow's leadership in the rest of the team and these elements of Zac Taylor's steadiness in the rest of the team. And so I think that's a really good point to talk about how those two guys are in such lockstep. But Matt,
outside of Eli Apple's Twitter, that is.
Well, and sometimes Quentin Spain's, if we're being honest, they have some guys that like to get out there on social media. Tyler Boyd sometimes gets a little chirpy, but that's a modern NFL. And I think Taylor gets all that. We talked about that when they hired him. He gets the social media thing, but neither here nor there.
That's the interesting aspect of it too, is it's like, it's not like it's really rehearsed. It's not the Patriot way.
Right.
I live in New England, and my favorite Patriots were like one of my favorite Patriots was Aqib Talib, because Aqib Talib was just never going to do the Patriot way in press conferences. Brady was above it. Like, Brady didn't have to do it. Gronk was going to be himself too. But like, Talib was just completely Aqib Talib was just being himself in press conferences. And, you didn't have that rehearsed scripted thing. James, you're a professional. You know what I mean? I'm a blogger, so you probably have more experience with those sort of situations than I do. But to me, with the Bengals, it's like it feels like they're all on the same page. It doesn't feel like they're all reading the same script.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. We've had Brian Callahan on a bunch, right? And it sounds almost identical to what Zach says. It's just a different way. It's Brian's style of saying it versus, Zach's versus Joe's. And so I totally agree there. And that's an exciting part about the future of the Bengals. We'll continue this conversation with Matt coming up. But first, a word from betonline.net. Football might be over, but basketball is full steam ahead. And whether it's the pros after the All-Star game, maybe it's college and you want to wager on my UC Bearcats. They're struggling right now. You can do all of that and so much more at betonline.net with all the latest odds, player performance props, and so much more. It's the best spot for all of your scores and news this season. And it's not just basketball. They got you covered for UFC, boxing, and so much more at betonline.net. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get started right now. Again, that's betonline.net, where the game starts.
Where I wanted to go, Matt, next is this play calling discussion. Right? There's this group of people, and there's probably some truth to it, right? Fans in general. I wonder if there's a fan base out there that thinks, you know what, that offensive coordinator, man, he's never messed up. There's always something that NFL fans like to take issue with. There are times that James and I have taken issue with some of the decisions. One of them that we talked about before we started recording is this whole idea of Samaje Perine being on the field for that last drive of the game in the Super Bowl, and some of the spots where he's been used that have been criticized throughout the playoffs. The ball that bounces off his hands that gets intercepted, for example, another one of those. And so there's that element of it. And there's also the some critics out there that rightly or wrongly would say something like, why isn't there RPO game? Where's the naked boots? Where's the hurry up? Where are all these elements that could be used to try to protect the offensive line a little bit more and get Joe Burrow going? So when you see that sort of stuff, Matt, as a guy that has coaching experience, as a guy that believes in Zac Taylor, what's your kind of retort or response to those sorts of ideas?
Well, I mean, I'm 100% with it because there's definitely a lot of things that I'd love to see too. And I think a lot of the time, a lot of the complaints that people make about play calling really come down to situational football, whether it be what you're doing on fourth down, a personnel thing like Samaje Perine, going for two, clock management. Like, to me, those are things that Marvin Lewis was not the best at. Stepping in and taking part of. But whoever it is, like the head coach, regardless if he's calling plays, regardless if he's an offensive guy, he should be the one that's ultimately responsible for those sort of things. I remember in a few years ago, there was a situation with Todd Haley driving the ball when he was the offensive coordinator with the Steelers, and like they ran out of time. It was against the Patriots. It was like right before the half. They ran out of time. I think the tight end got tackled on like the 1 yard line or something like that. And people were like losing their minds over Todd Haley. And I'm like, Mike Tomlin's got to have control over that. Like Mike Tomlin knows better than that. He's a better coach than that. So I think a lot of times we get kind of swept up in some of that stuff. In terms of you should be running this, you should be running that. Like, there's a finite amount of practice time. And everything's got to be right with these things, and everybody's got to be on the same page with these things. A lot of it comes down to Burrow, which, because we know we can throw a lot at him, because he's got a lot of experience with RPOs, like that makes it a little tougher to excuse. Like, everybody else is doing the same stuff, and you could really make it a case that I think somebody made a case that they're so good at screens because it doesn't look like their O-line's pass blocking ever. You could probably make a similar case with the RPOs, that it wouldn't look any different than any other kind of runner or anything like that. And you probably you never have to worry about getting a legal man downfield because they wouldn't get off the line of scrimmage or something. But so I mean, I think there are some things to be said for that. But I think that, like you said, sometimes it's nitpicky. It's like, well, every fan base is going to complain about that stuff. I don't think they didn't run a running back screen in the Super Bowl. think they ran like one receiver screen. That is crazy to me.
That blew my mind because they're
Like,
so bad at defending the screen.
yeah, and with everything else they do to protect Burrow, to protect that offensive line, um, that was like I didn't even realize it during the game, and then like I heard somebody talking about it later. I was like, holy crap, they really didn't. So that was kind of mind blowing. So by no means am I saying that he's a perfect play caller. I just feel that like you can see the cultural shift and the buy-in that these players have. Um, and I think that's a much more valuable thing, and that's going to play much. It's going to come around a lot more, and I do think he's grown. I think he's grown as a play caller, which you don't always see. But when you don't fire guys after 2 years, like they have a chance to get better at these things. Like we were talking off air about Jamar Chase complaining about not being played in the slot. That speaks to a few different things. Number one, that a culture that's strong enough to survive that happening, because I think outsiders see that, non-Bengals people see that, and their first thing is, oh, Cincinnati's falling apart, like, oh, or there's a diva receiver, because that's what we're used to happening in those situations. But it never became a thing, number one. And number two, they started doing it, and Chase had a lot of success in the slot. They were moving him around quite a bit after that. So, it was you got Taylor, who's doesn't have such a big ego that he can't take it, even when it's in a public forum like that. And who's willing to listen and be like, well, yeah, shit, let's get you against the nickel corner. Like that makes sense. You're our best player. Let's get you the ball. So I think that speaks to the culture and the way that he's able to learn from his mistakes, and the way that he's able to listen. We talk about having, in our non-football, non-podcasting, non-blogging lives, having good bosses, and how bosses treat you. Like the boss that you can come to and say, hey, I don't like the way you're doing this. I think we should do it like that. And they're like, yeah, like they actually think about it, and they actually take your ideas, and they're not just like, nah, I make more money than you. You know what I mean? Like that, there's huge value to that as well.
Yeah, I think that might be his biggest strength is, he's willing to listen, and it feels like he can be approached by, this locker room now and the culture they have. But two, and you mentioned it, the growth. You signed Zac Taylor to a 4-year extension. He's no longer the league's 32nd highest paid coach like he was the first 3 seasons of his tenure here in Cincinnati. And so you do that because not for the guy that coached in the Super Bowl, because there were multiple times this year I thought there were times where you're like, man, really? Like this is what you're going to do? But you're hoping that 39-year-old Zac Taylor, 40-year-old Zac Taylor, 41-year-old Zac Taylor is better than 38-year-old Zac Taylor. And I think that's the exciting part to me, is he, much like a quarterback, much like Jamar Chase at 21 years old, right? Zac Taylor at 41 might be really, really, really good. And there's a path for that to happen. So that's why you invest. And obviously he had success this year. That's not necessarily why I'm excited about the extension. I think the reason you get excited about the extension is where he could end up being the coach he could end up becoming, because he has shown that growth, that steady progress over the past couple of seasons.
Yeah, and I don't feel like that doesn't always happen with these guys too.
No,
a lot of them
doesn't.
they just kind of do their thing. And a lot of guys just have a system. I mean, this outside of the fact that they were running 11 personnel, this looks nothing like the Rams team that he came from. Like we were all talking about. You're not seeing nearly as much of the bunch, and so there's some flexibility there, which I mean kind of ties into something that Jake, you had mentioned off air about how they still don't have the offensive line. So what they're running is they're surviving with it. They're running the ball on 2nd and 10, and we all complain about that. That's probably like Twitter's most favorite thing to complain about is running the ball on 2nd and long. But if your offensive line stinks, if you're going to throw the ball every 2nd and long, you're really giving yourself 2 3rd and longs. You know what I mean? Because they're just going to tee off on you, and you got those guys that can't protect for that long, and you're putting them in a really bad situation. So, what kind of a play caller is Zac Taylor? If they sign Teron Armstead and James Daniels, and draft a guy next year, and all of a sudden they can protect Burrow for as long as they want.
That's something that really stands out to me when you look at Burrow's production, and something that we'll talk about later this week on the Locked On Bengals podcast is Joe Burrow in the intermediate part of the field. I think that they want to do a lot more there, and they just can't protect it because some of that stuff is longer developing. And we'll wrap up our conversation with Matt about Zac Taylor's coaching prowess, get into the way that culture translates to the field. We talked about the Jamar Chase example, but not just that. Zac Taylor is a head coach. A lot made of him as just an offensive play caller, but obviously head coaches have a lot more going on than just calling plays. We'll wrap up that conversation coming up next.
Today's episode brought to you by Rock Auto. RockAuto.com is a one-stop shop for all of your auto parts needs. It doesn't matter what make or model you drive. Maybe you drive a Toyota Corolla, a Daewoo, a Kia, a Mercedes-Benz like Matt Minnich over there. It doesn't matter what you drive. They're going to have the parts that you need for your vehicle to make sure you have that reliable transportation to get you from A to B anytime you need to. So make sure you check them out right now at rockauto.com, and don't spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts that you can have delivered conveniently to your home right now by going to rockauto.com. Check out all the parts available for your car, truck, and be sure to write Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box so they know we sent you? Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
All right, Matt, let's finish up with some of the remaining strengths of Zac Taylor as a head coach from your perspective. We've talked about, the way that he may be limited by his offensive line, some legitimate criticism, some areas for growth that he still has, and he's been growing as a coach. We've talked about that. And the one thing that you mentioned to me before we started recording is, something that made me think about the way culture translates to the football field, and the way that Taylor is thinking about his defense when he's going about his game planning.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about situational football. I think complementary football gets really, really overlooked, and it, sometimes you're running the ball because you're trying to protect the offensive line. But I think there's also an aspect of running the ball trying to protect the defense a little bit too. This defense was much improved. The talent was much better than what they've been in the past. But I still think that if you're asking them to be on the field all day long, like, you're going to have some problems. You got to have some breakdowns, and like we saw that in the Super Bowl. Like we saw in the Super Bowl, they were getting stop after stop after stop, and then when it gets a little bit later in the game and they're worn down, like, eventually it's getting tired. But it's also just kind of the way the NFL is set up. Like, you could only stop an offense so many times. So I think we have seen a fair amount of that where they're using the ball, they're using the clock, effectively on offense and not putting too much in the defense. They're generally not putting the defense in bad situations. There's another part of Twitter, that looks at the analytics and says, let's go for it on fourth down every time. And, I think there are times you go for it on fourth down, and there are times not to go for it on fourth down. And I think sometimes we don't think about what happens in the other end of that. We don't think about going for it on fourth down in the beginning of the Super Bowl and at least do a score for the other team. Like, you've got to be able to balance those things out and weigh the risk reward of things, and not put your defense in too many bad situations. I'll also jump back to week 2 of 2021, Thursday Night Football against the Cleveland Browns. The Bengals had no defensive line. I think Daniels was out that game. Gino was out. Like, Covington might have been signed on like Tuesday or something like that. Like, they didn't have anybody, and they're playing this team that can run like crazy, and it has this great offensive line, Chubb, the whole works. They stopped the Browns on fourth down on the goal line at the beginning of the third quarter of that game, and they were in a position where, like, they might have been able to wage a comeback. And ran a twist. I think it was Fred Johnson missed the block at right guard. Burrow strip sack.
Yep.
The game was over. like they just, like, the defense just put it all out there, and they couldn't do it again. The Browns scored in like 2 plays after that. They were just done at that point. And then couple drives later, like the Browns come out and they're running the ball like 8 yards per carry or something like that because the defense was just done. Like they gave it all, they put it all out there, and they were toast. But if the offense puts them in that bad situation, like there's only so long you can do it for. So I think understanding that aspect of complementary football, trying not to put too much on your defense, which like you've got to weigh the risk reward of those types of situations when it comes down to field position. We talk about going for it on fourth down in the Super Bowl. Like the average field position in the Super Bowl, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was a ridiculous difference between the two teams. I don't want to say something and have it be wrong, but it was like 2 first downs difference. So it was something in that ballpark. That's putting the defense in a bad situation when you're letting them eat up that all the time. When you can't get first downs, you can't keep them off the field. Like they're gonna cave at some point. They're gonna fall at some point. And really, I think that's why, like you see, people talk about bend don't break defense, and it kind of has a negative connotation to it sometimes. But like that's the only way you can play in the NFL because the offense is gonna have their opportunities. Like you got to stay on top of it, and then be good situationally in the red zone, which they were not in the Super Bowl, to be able to get those stops because the game's just so built for the offense that if you put them in positions, too many 50-50 types, positions, like they're gonna get them. They're gonna keep taking those shots.
Yeah, right. Cooper Cup's going to beat Eli Apple with the game on the, like it's going to happen a number of times, and you just have to be able to overcome it. So, yeah, I agree there, and I think that it's funny as you were talking about like putting the defense in bad situations. I felt like all year long in the press box at Paul Brown Stadium, I'm like, how long can this defense hold up? Because it was like another punt or a turnover, especially in the first half of the year, right? It was a turnover, and it's like, all right, can you hold them to a field goal to stay in this game? And there was a lot of times where they put the defense in a rough situation, and to their credit, the defense usually stepped up, but you can only do that so often.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. thought that just said I was muted, so I stopped talking. But and I think it's interesting too that early in the year, Zac Taylor kind of took some heat because in a press conference he said the defense wasn't getting enough turnovers, and like if you're looking at him as the offensive coordinator, then you are absolutely right to say, well, that's BS because you guys are turning the ball over way too much. But if you look at him as a head coach, like he was right. Like they weren't getting turnovers at the beginning of the year. And both of those things needed to change. And we did see that. And that was when they started winning, was when they started winning the turnover battle. They started giving Burrow more opportunities and not blowing it, not putting the defense in bad situations by throwing turnovers and getting them back in the field, putting them in bad field position, things like that. We saw a much better position when they were able to do those things. So again, that's an aspect of, well, let's not look at him as the offensive coordinator because he's not. He's the head coach. So you got to be able to judge him on all those things and how they mesh up with each other.
Yeah, you're right. There was an emphasis put on turnovers, and once Joe Burrow started getting luckier with not having touchdown passes turn into interceptions, for example, things started to look a lot better, and the Bengals got better results. But Matt, where I want to close is if you, from a coaching perspective, had to give Zac Taylor a priority list, here's your top 2 or 3 things that you can take away from this season to build on and get better at next year. What comes to mind for you if you were given that task?
That's an excellent question. I think that they have been pretty good for the most part in the situational football. Winning that middle 8, being able to to turn around in that aspect. A couple of things that stand out though, and they're pretty obvious ones. They're ones we know about. Like they don't do well at the beginning of games. They were really slow to start. So I think that it speaks. I think it speaks to the maybe a limitation in the game planning a little bit. I think they're very good at figuring out what's going on and adjusting to that in game, which is a very new concept in Cincinnati after what we saw before that. So they're very good at doing that. But I don't know, maybe there's just a little too much like sampling. Maybe they're just kind of running a little bit too much stuff just to see how the defense will respond to it. Maybe that stuff needs to be sprinkled in over a little bit wider time frame and make sure they keep the chains moving while they're doing it. The red zone seemed like it was good for a while there, and then it tapered off and ended up being a real big problem at the end of the year too. And I thought it was interesting because they don't talk much about who does what, but when they were doing pretty well, Zac Taylor mentioned Troy Walters by name as being the guy that was responsible for that. I feel like they don't give us that information very often, but they need to address that. That could be a fixing the O-line thing, though, because I mean, let's face it, like if you can't run the ball and they're going to tee off on you, like you're not going to have a lot of issues. You're going to have a lot of issues down there,
and you got to be able to block in the red zone.
Yeah, so so that could be a part of it, absolutely. But I think those would be the two biggest things are really looking at kind of from an offensive perspective. Because I do think they do a good job with situational football. They do overall they do a good job with understanding complementary football. That working the middle third the way the middle eight the way they do, which is some teams do it, but I feel like not a lot of people kind of emphasize that and realize that that's basically a turnover right there. That you're scoring twice in a row without giving them another opportunity to. So. I mean, really, I think his big areas for growth really are as an offensive play caller and a game planner.
That makes sense to me. I think that the script is a one thing where you're right. They're so good at figuring it out and adjusting and getting there. But if they could maintain that and also capitalize on those first drives, that would be a big step forward in like game script and all this stuff, and would just have a nice little domino effect in the right direction for this team. That's Matt Minnich talking Zac Taylor, a nice long offseason episode talking about the Bengals' newly extended head coach. You can find him again on Twitter at Coach Minnich. He does some great work with Cincy Jungle and on the Chalk Talk podcast. Matt, appreciate the time and insight and coaching perspective on the Bengals head coach.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Until next time, Bengals fans, we're going to get into free agency. Laramie Tunzel, a trade idea perhaps. Mike Hilton's out there doing some recruiting. We'll get into all that this week and maybe some draft stuff as well. Until next time, Bengals fans, hoo day and have a good one.